Now, if you have been with us the last several weeks, you know that we've been going through 2 Thessalonians, and before that, we were going through 1 Thessalonians. And if you've been paying attention and you're keeping notes, you're thinking to yourself, Craig opposed the central application of 1 Thessalonians. And if you were here last week when we talked about the central application of 2 Thessalonians, you've noticed this other common theme. Craig also opposed the central application of 2 Thessalonians. And it would lead you to a natural conclusion, which is, therefore, Craig is opposed to 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And if you came to this conclusion, I have to tell you, I do not blame you one bit. But I also have a confession that I would like to say to all of you this morning. I absolutely love 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And if you're wondering why that is, it's because we have to talk about historical context and literary analysis. Can I get a hallelujah? We're going to talk about these things on a Saturday morning, and you're here, and we could not be more excited. So let's dive into some historical context and literary analysis of 1 and 2 Thessalonians, shall we? 4 people are excited. I'll get the rest of you by the end of this sermon. About 2,000 years ago, there was a man born in a tiny little town based on which gospel you read, whether it's Nazareth or Bethlehem, and this man's name was Jesus. Now, Jesus grew up in Nazareth, and he was a carpenter by trade, and he was doing his work until one day he left his hometown and began to preach the good news that the kingdom of God was near. Now, this good news was threatening not only to the religious institution of the day, but also the political system of the day. And so church and state rallied together to crucify Jesus sometime around the year 30 CE. Now, the Christian tradition is built on the fact that 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead and spoke to people once again, and Christians told everyone that this changes everything. And so the Christian message began to spread around Judea, primarily in the Middle East, but in this little tiny window, but it was starting to threaten people who were religious officials already. One of those people was a man named Paul, who did not like Christians at all. So much so that Paul would persecute and even participate in public executions of Christians. That all changed one day when Paul was on his way to Damascus to go persecute Christians, when God interrupted Paul and said, "Paul, why do you persecute me?" And Paul all of a sudden had a change of heart. Within a matter of days, he converted to Christianity, returned to Jerusalem, to the people he persecuted and said, "I'm one of you now. I identify as a Christian." Well, the people that were Christian looked at him very suspiciously, as they would, and they started to talk to him with a distance. They started to say, "Are we sure Paul isn't going to turn on us in an instant?" And Paul said, no, I'm not going to turn on you. And he began to learn about who Jesus was. And the people that were Christian took him under their wing, and they started telling him all about who Jesus was. This went on for about a decade before around the year 49, when Paul was sent out on his first missionary journey. He was sent out on his first missionary journey, and then shortly after that, he was sent out on his second missionary journey. And the second missionary journey went all the way up through modern-day Turkey and into modern-day Greece, where at the top of Greece, or the northernmost point, there was one place he stopped called a town called Thessalonica. Now, if you were to go there today, this is what it would look like. It's a coastal town, and Paul arrived in Thessalonica sometime around the year 49, and he showed up and he told the Thessalonians, "Jesus is coming back soon." To which the Thessalonians said, "How soon are we talking, Paul?" And Paul said, "So soon that many of you, none of you, will die before he returns." Now, the people of Thessalonica heard this and they loved it. They started converting to Christianity, and this made other people very upset, particularly people who were religious or were part of a larger political system. They got so upset that they formed a mob and they ran Paul out of town, and Paul had to go all the way down to Corinth, where he stayed for several months and worked with the Corinthian church. While he was in Corinth, he received a message from the Thessalonian church, and this message was a sad message. While we don't know the exact contents of that message, we know that it told Paul that people in the Thessalonian church had started dying, and that the Thessalonians were attending church in a service they never thought they would have because of what they believed. They attended church as a funeral. And at a funeral, you can imagine they were sitting there in this church looking at each other saying, this wasn't supposed to happen. We were promised that Jesus would come back before any of us died. And so for that reason, Paul wrote a response to the Thessalonians. This response would eventually become the book in Christian Bibles known as 1 Thessalonians. And in there, Paul writes to people who are grieving, who thought Jesus would come back before any of them died. We read these words from 1 Thessalonians, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others who do not have hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died." A few verses later, Paul writes, "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape." And when you look at what Paul is saying, he's saying, like, I know I told you Jesus was coming back soon. I want to reiterate that I still believe that. Jesus is going to come back so soon that you'll be minding your own business, and then God will show up like a thief in the night. In other words, the central application of 1 Thessalonians is Jesus is coming back soon. Paul says, I know you're worried about it, but I promise you, Jesus is coming back any minute now. Just hold on a little bit longer. So he wrote this letter sometime around the year 50 CE. A little while later, Paul, about 8 years later, was arrested in Jerusalem for reasons that we don't need to get into this morning. He was then brought all the way over to Rome, where he lived under house arrest for several years, until around the year 62, where he was executed for his belief in the city of Rome. About 90 years after his death, the Christian message had spread across the Mediterranean Sea like wildfire. There were churches in Africa, there were churches in Spain, there were churches on islands, there were churches in what is modern-day Italy. All of these things kept believing the gospel of Jesus, and they heard the good news, and they continued to spread the message of Jesus Christ. And it's in this context, around 150 CE, or about 100 years after 1 Thessalonians, that 2 Thessalonians was written. According to Dr. David Harrell from Exeter University, he says 2 Thessalonians was intended to clarify and correct a reading of 1 Thessalonians by Christians whom the author regarded as error. In other words, these churches all around the Mediterranean had a copy of 1 Thessalonians, and the author of 2 Thessalonians says, there's something in this letter that's wrong and leading us in the wrong direction. So I'm going to pretend I'm Paul and write 2 Thessalonians to correct what Paul said 100 years ago. So with that in mind, we turn to 2 Thessalonians with an anticipation that this is going to correct what the author considered wrong in Paul's original letter of 1 Thessalonians. We read in chapter 2 these words, "As to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we beg you, brothers and sisters, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as though from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is already here. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the lawless one is revealed, the one destined for destruction. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. And you know what is now restraining him? So that he may be revealed when his time comes. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but only until the one who now restrains it is removed, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will destroy with the breath of his mouth, annihilating him by the manifestation of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is apparent in the workings of Satan, who uses all power, signs, lying wonders, and every kind of wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion, leading them to believe what is false, so that all who have not believed the truth but took pleasure in righteousness will be condemned." Now that was a mouthful, wasn't it? But when we read it closely, what the author is saying is he's saying like, hey, you've heard that Jesus has already come back and left some of us behind. It's not true. There's a whole bunch of things that have to happen before Jesus comes back, and it's a lot of things. In other words, 2 Thessalonians wants its readers to know Jesus is not coming back soon. It wants to be very clear. There's all sorts of signs that have to happen. An antichrist has to show up, but before the antichrist, he has to be unrestrained by society. So we're not even close, the author of 2 Thessalonians says. Don't fall for anyone who says it's any minute now, which is fascinating because here in 1 Thessalonians, you have this story that Paul writes to other people who are grieving, and then 100 years later, you have an author writing a very different message, and it's almost like there's this line right down the middle between them. 1 Thessalonians tells us Jesus is coming back soon. 2 Thessalonians is like, no, Jesus is not coming back soon. And you look at these books that are right next to each other in the New Testament, who many people think are written by the same author, and you say to yourself, why? Why is it that they just can't agree and get on the same page? Wouldn't it be more convenient if everyone in the Bible just believed the same thing? Wouldn't that make it easier for all of us if they all just believed what was right and then we could go to the book and understand what the correct belief was supposed to be? Now, I have to tell you, that is not far off from what I was taught the Bible was when I was growing up. I was told that the purpose of this book was to help us believe correctly. My friends, it's not, as evidenced by 1 and 2 Thessalonians. Not only that, if you wanted a little bit more evidence, I would say if you have this idea that the Bible exists to help you believe correctly, I would say that most Christians say that you need to believe in the Trinity in order to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, right? There's just one problem. The word Trinity is nowhere in the Bible. It is an extra biblical doctrine that was added centuries after Jesus rose from the dead in order for Christians to process how Jesus could both be fully human and fully divine. So if it's about believing correctly, and we say that Trinity is one of the foundational beliefs of Christianity, well, then the Bible has missed the point in how to help us believe correctly. It's not that kind of book. A much better definition of the Bible, in my opinion, is that this is a book about being human and trying to understand our existence through the lens of faith. In other words, it's human beings trying their best to understand and comprehend God, and there's some certainty, and there's some doubt, and there's some mystery, and there's people who believe different things, and it's all brought together in this book with disagreeing opinions and also agreeing opinions and certain inspiration and also uninspired passages. And if you look at all that that Bible entails and the fact that it's all bound together in one book, you start to say, that looks a lot like my life today. And I hope that when you see the Bible through that lens, all of a sudden you can understand why I stand before you and say, this is why I love 1 and 2 Thessalonians. Because my friends, this is a story about how to get along with people who do not believe the same things as you. And I have to tell you, in the last 3 years, the number one question I've received as a pastor from this congregation and from people outside is, how do I get along with the people who do not believe the same as me? It is a deep spiritual question that I think every Christian should be asking right now. And thank goodness for our tradition, because you don't have to go back that far to realize that Christians have been thinking about this for a very long time. Let's go back to the 80s, shall we? And not just anywhere in the 80s. Let's go to Stockholm, Sweden, with a man named Christer Stendahl, who lived in the 20th century, and from 1984 to 88, he was the Church of Sweden's Bishop of Stockholm. Now, I did not know before I heard this story that there was such a thing as Church of Sweden, even though I am Swedish by ethnic origin. I had no idea it existed, but there is a Church of Sweden, and Christer Stendahl, after teaching at Harvard, went to Stockholm in order to become the Bishop of Stockholm for the Church of Sweden. Now, shortly after he arrived there, there was a problem, because the people from Sweden liked the Church of Sweden, and they didn't like many other people. Specifically, there was this new upstart religion that was moving into town, specifically Stockholm, and this new upstart religion wanted to build a church right in downtown Stockholm, and not just any church, but a massive structure. This church belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or as it's known today, the Mormon Church. And so people from Stockholm went to Bishop Stendahl and said, Bishop Stendahl, how do we get along with people who do not believe all the same things that we do? And Bishop Stendahl would tell them how it was, and they'd say, we don't like that answer. We'd much rather have you say they just need to get out and leave us alone. Instead, Bishop Stendahl went around Stockholm and he started telling people about how we get along with people who believe differently than us. And while he said several different things, there were really three principles that stood out that he consistently said over and over again. The first principle was he told the people of Stockholm, when trying to understand another religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion and not its enemies. So if you want to understand Mormonism, don't go to the Church of Sweden and ask them about Mormonism. Go to the Mormon Church and ask them about Mormonism. If you have a problem with another religion today, have you talked to anybody from that religion and asked them about that religion? If the answer is no, you might be hating your idea of that religion more than the religion itself. Number 2 for principles is don't compare your best to their worst. It is easy to make Christianity look really good and all the other religions look really bad if you take the best of Christianity and compare it to the worst of their religion. Conversely, it is very easy to make Christianity look real bad if you take the worst of Christianity and compare it to the best of another religion. This is not an exercise toward truth. This is an exercise of propaganda. Number 3, and my personal favorite, he told people to leave room for holy envy. Oh, I love that phrase. What is holy envy, you ask? Holy envy is the ability to look at someone else's religion and say what it is that you admire about that religion and how it has helped you to understand God better in your own religion. Specifically, Krister Stendahl said, you know what I appreciate about the Mormon Church? This whole practice of vicarious baptism. The idea that they go through lists of names and they baptize themselves in honor of someone else's names, it connects us back to the past and reminds us that God is much bigger than just one religion. And he actually became a big proponent of this in Sweden. He actually wrote for Mormon publications talking about the value of the practice of vicarious baptism. And whether you agree with that practice or not is irrelevant. What's important is the bishop of the Church of Sweden of Stockholm got up and said, I want to tell you what I appreciate about the Mormon Church to people who wanted him to tell them what was wrong with the Mormon Church. Now, I have found this to be true in my own life, and if you've been here before, you at some point have probably heard me talk about my friend Tyler from Montana State University. Now, Tyler's an atheist, I'm a Christian, and I went to church school all the way up until college, and then I became friends with Tyler, and we were cordial for about 3 months, and then we started getting into it on religion, right? And for 4 years, we sat next to each other, and the one question that Tyler always asked me was simply this: do you actually believe that, Craig? Or is that something that was just given to you that you were told to believe? Now, this walked me through a massive deconstruction that led me to wanting to be a pastor. And after 4 years of being asked this question, I often think of Tyler when I write sermons here for Paradox. Now, I don't write these sermons in order to convert Tyler. Instead, I write them asking those questions. Do I actually believe this? And then thinking to myself, how can I respect who Tyler is through this sermon and not try to convert as much as to respect it, and then also to respond with, allow me to share what I believe with you. I tell you all of this because if at any point, if you've been here before and if you've enjoyed just one of my sermons and it's helped you to love God more, chances are the reason you can love God more now is because of an atheist. And he has a massive influence on the words that come out of my mouth, and I am still very much a Christian, and I have appreciated the question from atheism, which is, do you actually believe that, Craig? What a gift to get that question from him. Now, when you consider that, in all of those different principles, we look at these two opposing realities between 2 Thessalonians and 1 Thessalonians. Now, we're going to take them individually and look about what it is that we can find for holy envy in each of them, and then look at them together. So let's start with 2 Thessalonians, the idea that Jesus is not coming back soon. This belief is held by many people, some of which are in this room. And if we were to go back and look through 2 Thessalonians, I think it's good to look at the book, read it all the way through, and then ask a question: what is the worst I can assume about the church leader when he wrote this? Think about it for a moment. The worst we can assume is that he wrote this to maintain control and power. And he said, just don't think Jesus is coming back because I like my life and I don't want you to change anything. Conversely, we can ask, what is the best I can assume about this church leader when he wrote this? Well, let's just assume that there are people who are throwing their lives away because they think Jesus is coming back tomorrow. So this guy's like, hey, you should get back to work and invest in your future. Jesus isn't coming back for a while, so why don't you take care of your family because you keep putting them off? This is the best I can assume about the church leader who wrote 2 Thessalonians. Now, another question we should ask is, am I annoyed with other people who believe the ideas in this letter, like, people who don't believe in the resurrection of Christ? And if the answer is yes, I think a question we all have to ask is, do I hold this annoyance because I have not made peace with my past self for believing this? Am I annoyed with somebody else because they represent something I don't like about myself or a chapter in my own history? I have found that this question often holds up a mirror and makes people realize, oh, I'm part of the problem, they aren't the problem. The last question I think we should ask when going through these books individually is, even if I disagree with what 2 Thessalonians has to offer, what can I appreciate about this belief, this practice, or this religion? Specifically, what can I appreciate about believing that Jesus is not coming back soon, if at all? For me, I want to tell you what I appreciate about that. For me, doubting the second coming of Christ can inspire me to embrace the beauty of the present. Because rather than living for another day, I say to myself, oh no, maybe this is all there is. And I throw myself with all of my love into today. 3 years ago was a very important day in my household because we took our oldest daughter to kindergarten for the very first time. This was taken in 2019, and my daughter could not wait to get to school, and I could not wait to take her. Why? Because it's amazing taking your kid to kindergarten. For the first day, do you think I showed up and I said, okay, I gotta go, we'll see you later, have a great day, lots of work to do, gotta get out there? No, I parked the car. I got out with my son, with my wife, we walked her into school, we stayed in the classroom until the teacher said, really, it's time to go. Because I wanted every minute of that. And thank God, because I got this experience one more time with my son just a few weeks ago. He had his first day of kindergarten. What do you think we did? We parked the car, we went into the room, we stayed as long as we could before the teacher said, it's seriously time to go. I am fortunate enough to have this experience twice in my life, and now it's over. I'm not going to take my kid to kindergarten on the first day ever again. And I tell you this because I have found that few things are as sacred as a child's first day of kindergarten. And if I miss it, then I miss out on what is sacred. And so if I say to myself, you know what, life's going to be so much better in heaven, I can't wait to go to paradise, I might miss paradise happening right in front of me. I might say, oh, Maya, Bodhi, I know it's your first day of kindergarten. I got to go save some souls for the afterlife. So that's more important. We'll be happier later. I can miss it if I don't doubt the second coming of Christ. That's not the end of the story, though. Because the opposite belief in 1 Thessalonians is Jesus is coming back soon. Now, let's go through those series of questions again. What is the worst I can assume about Paul when he wrote this? Well, the worst I can assume is that he wrote this to grieving people and he didn't want to grieve alongside them, so he said, just believe more. Okay? That's the worst. But what is the best I can assume about Paul when he wrote this? We can assume that Paul was trying to help people as they processed grief. And while some may say it's not the healthiest method, it may have been what that group wanted to hear, because if you don't like 1 Thessalonians, what you cannot argue with is that Paul genuinely cares about those people. Now, we could say, am I annoyed with other people who believe that the second coming of Christ is going to happen soon? If the answer is yes, hold up that mirror and say, do I hold this annoyance because I have not made peace with my past self for believing this? Am I looking back at my past self and saying, that was so stupid? How could you, Craig? Because if I'm mad at myself, I will be infinitely more annoyed with other people who hold a similar belief today, and I will be unempathetic toward them. Which brings us to the last question, which is, even if I disagree with it, what can I appreciate about this belief, this practice, or this religion? And for me, believing in the second coming of Christ can inspire me to have hope in tomorrow. As Hadley said earlier today, it can be daunting thinking about bringing kids into this world. My wife and I have already brought kids into this world, so we're living the daunting reality, right? And you hear rumors or scientific facts about climate change, and it is frightening, right? Not only that, but you feel political unrest, you feel anger, you feel all these news stories that are telling you it's bad, it's getting worse, it's awful, terrible, give up. And yet, I have this hope because I still believe in the second coming of Christ. I believe that tomorrow has the potential to be better today. And I have this hope that I keep holding to because I say to myself, you know what? Even though it's dark, I still believe that tomorrow can be better than today. Even if I have to work for it, even if I have to push for it, there's still something beyond my control that can intervene and make tomorrow better than today. And this belief helps me to have so much hope for these kids today. And so when we look at these two diametrically opposed beliefs, we often think of a barrier between them, but I love them together. I love it without any barrier. Because what it teaches me is that this idea that these things are separate is false. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians teaches us that Jesus is and is not coming back soon. And while that may seem difficult to grasp, I want to tell you what I have found to work in my life. I have found that it is the most helpful to believe and to doubt the second coming of Christ simultaneously. And if you're thinking to yourself, that is the most paradoxical belief I could possibly come up with, welcome. We named the church after this. Spiritual maturity requires an embrace of paradox rather than a resolution of paradox. And this is a perfect example, in my opinion, where it is good and healthy and mature to both believe and to doubt the second coming of Christ so that you can embrace today and also have hope for tomorrow. I absolutely love being part of this community. I love it because we talk about traditions of the past, which tell us about the beauty of today and inform the hope that we have tomorrow. My friends, my wish for you this morning is that you may experience the traditions of the past and that they may help you to embrace the beauty of the present and inspire you to always have hope for the future. That's the beauty of the 2nd Thessalonians and 1st Thessalonians and why I love 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Amen.